again, casting long, skeletal shadows across the peeling wallpaper, and for a split second, I saw the true extent of the madness etched into the man's face. He didn't move like a normal person. His limbs were fluid and practiced, a result of months spent navigating the narrow, cramped voids between the lath and plaster of my home. I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that every private conversation I had held, every secret I had whispered into my phone, and every moment of vulnerability had been witnessed by this silent predator. The fire poker felt heavy and clumsy in my shaking hand, a blunt instrument against a man who clearly knew every crevice and hiding spot in this building. Why had I ignored the scratching in the ceiling, and why had I convinced myself that the missing items were just a result of my own forgetfulness? He began to circle the perimeter of the room, trailing the jagged glass along the wood paneling, creating a high-pitched screech that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. "You have such a nice life," he whispered, his voice raspy and thin from disuse, yet carrying a tone of entitlement that made my blood run cold. He told me about the previous owner, the woman who had disappeared, and how she had eventually stopped fighting back once she realized the house belonged to him. I felt a surge of nausea as I looked toward the closet, wondering if her remains were tucked away in the very crawl space I had used to store my winter clothes. The realization that I was standing on a graveyard disguised as a fixer-upper made the air feel even thinner, and I knew that if I didn't find a way out tonight, I would become just another footnote in the history of this cursed property. I calculated the distance to the door, but he was positioned perfectly, cutting off my only obvious exit while maintaining a distance that kept him out of reach of my poker. I had to create a distraction, something to break his rhythm and give me a fighting chance to reach the staircase and the front door. My mind raced through the layout of the house, remembering the loose floorboard in the hallway and the heavy coat rack that sat just outside the bedroom. If I could lure him into the narrow corridor, his familiarity with the walls might actually work against him in a physical struggle. I stepped back, intentionally tripping over a small footstool to make myself look weaker and more panicked than I actually was. He lunged forward with a guttural snarl, the glass blade slicing through the air where my chest had been only a second before. I swung the iron poker with everything I had, feeling the jarring impact as it connected with his shoulder, sending a spray of sweat and grime into the air. He didn't scream. He simply hissed and retreated back into the shadows of the doorway, his eyes glowing with a feral intensity that suggested pain only made him more dangerous. I didn't wait for a second strike. I bolted past him, my socks sliding on the polished wood as I scrambled into the pitch-black hallway. I could hear him behind me, the sound of his breathing becoming a rhythmic huffing that echoed off the high ceilings as he gave chase. I reached the top of the stairs and felt for the heavy oak banister, my feet moving by memory as I descended into the foyer. I could hear him sliding a panel open somewhere above me, a shortcut through the walls that would allow him to intercept me at the bottom of the flight. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a complex machine designed to trap its inhabitants, and he was the master operator. I saw the silhouette of the front door, the moonlight shining through the frosted glass, promising a world where people weren't hidden in the architecture. I reached for the deadbolt, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal, when I felt a hand reach out from the darkness of the coat closet and grab my ankle with a grip like a steel vise. I kicked out blindly, my heel connecting with something soft, and I heard a sharp intake of breath as the grip loosened just enough for me to pull away. I threw my weight against the door, the wood groaning as the latch finally cleared the frame, and I tumbled out onto the porch into the freezing rain. I didn't look back until I reached the end of the driveway, where the streetlights provided a thin veil of safety. Looking back at the Victorian, I saw a single curtain move in the upstairs window, and I knew that while I had escaped, the house still held its secrets. I realized then that I would never be able to go back for my belongings, because as long as those walls stood, they would always have eyes watching from the dark. The cabin was supposed to be my fresh start, but within 48 hours of arriving at the edge of the Blackwood wilderness, I realized that my uncle hadn't left me an inheritance so much as he had left me a target on my back. It sits at the end of a gravel road that the local maps seem to have forgotten, a structure of heavy pine and reinforced stone that feels more like a fortress than a vacation home. On the first night, the silence of the woods was broken by the sound of a heavy engine idling at the base of my driveway, followed by the rhythmic clicking of a high-powered flashlight sweeping across my bedroom windows. I stood behind the thick curtains, my heart thudding against my ribs, wondering why a group of men in a blacked-out SUV were inspecting a property that had been vacant for 6 months. I didn't know then that the ghosts the neighbors warned me about were actually men with a very specific and violent set of expectations. The haunting began subtly, with the sound of footsteps pacing across the attic floor directly above my bed at exactly 3 in the morning. I climbed the pull-down ladder with a heavy flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, expecting to find a raccoon or perhaps a squatter who had broken in during the transition of the deed. Instead, I found a pristine, empty room with one terrifying detail. A single military-grade radio sat in the center of the floor, its red power light glowing like a malevolent eye in the dark. As I approached it, the speaker crackled to life, and a voice that sounded like grinding gravel asked if the package was ready for the midnight pickup. I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that my uncle hadn't been a hermit. He had been a facilitator for something dark, and the men on the other end of that radio didn't care that the person currently living in the house was an innocent relative. I tried to leave the next morning, but when I walked out to my car, I found all 4 tires slashed with surgical precision and the spark plug wires ripped from the engine block. It was a clear message that I was being kept here, a prisoner in my own inheritance until whatever debt my uncle owed was settled in full. Why had he chosen me to receive this house? And did he know that he was handing me a death sentence wrapped in a legal document? I spent the afternoon barricading the doors with heavy furniture, my hands shaking as I hammered nails into the window frames, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in on me from all sides. Every snap of a twig or rustle of the wind felt like an intruder's footstep, and the curiosity of what was hidden in the house began to outweigh my fear of finding it. I began to tear apart the floorboards in the mudroom, driven by a frantic need to find the leverage I needed to buy my freedom from the men in the SUV. Beneath the heavy oak planks, I found a steel lockbox bolted to the foundation, hidden away from any casual observer or estate appraiser. Inside wasn't gold or cash, but a series of ledgers detailing dates, coordinates, and names of people who occupied very high positions in the local government. The ghosts weren't just criminals. They were the very people supposed to protect the community, and my uncle had been their record keeper. The realization that I couldn't call the police for help made the walls of the cabin feel like they were closing in, a wooden coffin designed specifically for me. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature in the cabin dropped, and I heard the familiar sound of the SUV returning to the base of the driveway. This time, they didn't just idle. I heard the heavy thud of multiple doors closing and the crunch of boots on the gravel path leading to my front porch. I retreated to the kitchen, clutching the ledgers to my chest, wondering if I should try to negotiate or if these men were the type to leave no witnesses behind. The power was suddenly cut, plunging the cabin into a thick, suffocating darkness that made the interior look like a distorted nightmare. I heard a heavy blow strike the front door, the wood splintering under the force of a sledgehammer, and I knew the haunting had finally reached its violent conclusion. I scrambled into the pantry, pulling the door shut just as the front entrance gave way with a deafening crash of breaking timber. I could hear them moving through the living room, their voices low and professional, calling out to each other with the efficiency of hunters. "He's in here somewhere," one of them said, his voice closer than I expected. "And he has the books." I realized that the only way out was the small ventilation window at the back of the pantry, a narrow gap that would be a tight squeeze even for someone of my build. As I felt the heat of their flashlights scanning the kitchen through the cracks in the pantry door, I knew that the debt I inherited was one that could only be paid in blood, and I had to decide right now if it was going to be mine or theirs. The heavy iron door in the corner of my basement wasn't mentioned in the real estate listing, and after living in this house for 2 weeks, I realized that the previous owners didn't leave it behind by accident. It is a massive, rusted slab of industrial steel that looks like it belongs in a Cold War bunker rather than a suburban home, and every night at exactly 3 in the morning, a rhythmic, hollow rattling echoes up through the floorboards of my bedroom. I told myself it was just the ancient plumbing or the house settling into the damp soil of the valley. But the sound is too deliberate, too much like a frantic hand searching for a latch that isn't there. I stood at the top of the cellar stairs last night with a flashlight in my hand, watching the shadows dance across the concrete, wondering why the air in the basement feels 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I didn't know then that the echo wasn't a ghost reaching out from the past, but a living person who was running out of time and oxygen just a few feet beneath my feet. The neighborhood is one of those quiet, manicured places where people move to forget their troubles, which made the sudden appearance of a black sedan idling outside my house every evening feel even more sinister. I would watch from the living room window as the driver sat in total darkness, his face obscured by the tint of the glass, just watching the front door as if waiting for a signal that never came. Why did the neighbors cross the street when they saw me working in the yard? And why did the local mail carrier refuse to walk up the steps to my porch? I began to realize that the house had a reputation that had nothing to do with spirits and everything to do with the man who lived here before me. A man who had suddenly disappeared without a single suitcase being packed. The basement echo became a constant, gnawing presence in my mind, a riddle that I knew I had to solve if I ever wanted to sleep through the night again. I finally gathered the courage to investigate the iron door during a heavy thunderstorm that muffled the sounds of my own movements against the concrete floor. I used a heavy crowbar to pry away the layers of paint and rust that had sealed the edges, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps as the metal finally began to groan and give way. As the door swung open, I expected to find a crawl space or an old coal chute, but instead, I stared down into a narrow, vertical shaft with a ladder bolted to the side. The smell that drifted up from the darkness was a mixture of damp earth and something sharply metallic, a scent that made the hair on my arms stand up in a primal warning. I climbed down, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick, stagnant air, until I reached a sub-basement that wasn't on any of the blueprints I had seen at the city clerk's office. The room was small and sterile, containing nothing but a single chair, a stack of canned food, and a series of monitors that were still flickering with grainy, black and white images of the rooms upstairs. I realized with a surge of pure terror that I had been living in a house that was designed to be a viewing gallery, and someone had been watching my every move from this hidden bunker. But the rattling hadn't come from the monitors. It was coming from a second, smaller door at the far end of the room, one that was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the lock, and the rattling stopped instantly, replaced by a low, desperate whimpering that broke my heart and froze my blood at the same time. "Please," a voice whispered from the other side. He said he was coming back for the final session tonight. I realized then that the ghost of the basement was a victim of a kidnapping that was still very much in progress, and the man in the black sedan outside wasn't a spirit, but the captor returning to finish his work. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I knew that by opening that iron door, I had stepped into the middle of an active crime scene with no easy way out. I fumbled with the crowbar, trying to bash the padlock open, the sound of the metal-on-metal clanging echoing up the shaft like a dinner bell for the predator waiting in the driveway. I heard the front door of the house click open upstairs, followed by the heavy, measured footsteps of someone who didn't need to hurry because they knew exactly where their prey was hiding. I managed to break the lock just as the footsteps reached the top of the cellar stairs, and I pulled the victim out of the dark cell, a young woman who looked like she hadn't seen a sun ray in months. We had no choice but to retreat further into the sub-basement, looking for any other exit as the sound of the intruder descending the ladder began to vibrate through the floorboards. The basement echo was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a countdown to a confrontation that I wasn't prepared for. We crouched in the shadows behind the monitoring desk, listening to the heavy boots hit the concrete floor, knowing that the only thing between us and a shallow grave was a narrow shaft of light and the hope that someone in the quiet neighborhood had finally decided to call the police.